Hi, Mark Granis here with Lecture 1.4 on Logic and Language. I apologize for my voice, but I know people are anxious to get this recording because of the traffic mayhem that occurred earlier this week in the Washington area. So here goes. Today's topic is logic and language. It's not so much a discrete topic as it is a theme that we're going to come back to time and again this year. There will never be a time this year when we are done talking about logic and language. So today is just the beginning. Our agenda for today is first to note the nature of our dependency on verbal expression, why we need words to convey our thoughts. Then we want to talk about how we verbally express the three acts of the mind and introduce the vocabulary we use there. And then finally, we'll talk about the specific domains of clarity, truth, validity, and soundness, which correspond to the three acts of the mind. Now, for our dependency on verbal expression, I want you to return to a thought experiment that we were using earlier this week. That was when I asked you to accompany me, at least in imagination, on a search for my car in an airport parking lot. Now, I want you to imagine that I'm the only person on that level of the airport parking lot, except for two other humans. One is a caveman and one is a Frenchman. The Frenchman speaks no English, and I speak no French. So let's imagine now, I would like to ask the caveman and the Frenchman if they could help me search for my car. I'd like to say something like, hey, have you seen a black sedan with Maryland license plates that spell out reason? But I can't do that. And it's instructive to think about why I can't do that. To get a handle on that, let's think about how much mental telepathy would or wouldn't help. With the caveman, it probably wouldn't help very much at all. That is, as we noted then, the caveman doesn't have a concept of a car or a sedan. He might have a concept for black, he might have a concept for big, but he doesn't certainly have a concept of license plate or know the alphabet. Whereas with the Frenchman, mental telepathy would basically solve the problem. If I could put the thoughts, have you seen a black sedan with Maryland license plates that spell reason, into his head, then he'd be fine. We would simply avoid the language problem. We would avoid the need for me to use the same words that he uses for those thoughts just by communicating the thoughts directly. Unfortunately, without mental telepathy, we do need language. We have to have some way of using a word to put a thought in someone else's head. Now, it happens that we can do this in any language. For example, I can say chair, I can say chaise in French or Stuhl in German, and all of these words to a speaker of that language will give that person exactly the same thought. It won't matter which language I have used as long as the person receiving that message speaks that language. This is also true for our judgments. I can say the chair is black, that's a judgment about the chair, or I can say der Stuhl ist schwarz in German, and that's the same thing. Those two different propositions in different languages express exactly the same judgment about the chair. And even with inferences, I can say therefore to show that I am making an inference, or in Latin I might say ergo. In fact, the ergo is common enough that that is a Latin word that has made its way over into English. But when I have to put my thoughts into words, the language adds at least some potential distortion or confusion. And we can see this easily in the case of different languages. For example, you've probably noticed that the German word Stuhl bears a striking resemblance to the English word stool. But they're not the same thing. Stuhl in German means chair. And as any native speaker of English will tell you, a chair is not quite the same thing as a stool. There's a difference in the actual idea that's communicated by the language. And this happens even when you don't translate. Is a love seat a chair? Or is there a difference there? Is a stool a chair? Or is there a difference there? There are sometimes subtle differences in the idea that is conjured up by any given term. In logic, we always aspire to look beyond the words to the thoughts that the words communicate. We are always interested in getting to the actual meat of the argument, which is, for us, contained in the concepts and the judgments and the inferences, not in the words that we use to express them. So an analogy that I like to use is that language is to logic as the pizza box is to the pizza. If I bring a pizza box into the classroom, everyone will get very excited, but they're not excited about the box. They're excited about the pizza. If you order a pizza during the football game and the pizza truck pulls up outside, everyone gets very excited. It's not about the pizza truck. It's about the pizza. So the pizza in this analogy is the thought, the concept, the judgment, the thing that the mental thing that is going on. It's not the container that we use to pass that around, like a pizza box or a pizza truck. Now, the verbal expressions for the three acts of the mind are pretty easy to keep straight. We've learned that the first act of the mind is simple apprehension, and we know that simple apprehension produces concepts. And we haven't studied concepts yet, but in Chapter 2, we will spend a lot of time with them. Now I'll just give you the definition, that a concept is an abstract, universal idea that our mind produces to organize and understand reality. When we try to communicate that concept to others, we use a term, and we can define term as the verbal expression of a concept. Chair in English, chaise in French, and Stuhl in German are all terms for the same concept. They're terms in different languages, but they all convey the same idea. The second act of the mind is judgment. And judgment, as we know, is where we are affirming or denying something about the way the subject of our judgment exists. We've crossed over that boundary between the first and second acts, that boundary which is affirming or denying something. Well, we express our judgments in propositions, and we'll learn a lot more about propositions in Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. But for now, let's define a proposition as the verbal expression of a judgment. If I say the chair is black, that's a proposition. And so is der Stuhl ist schwarz. Two propositions, each expressing the same judgment in different languages. The third act, inference, is a little trickier than the others on this point. At least it's trickier in English, because in English, we use the word inference to mean both the act of inferring something and our expression for what's inferred, the way we state what's inferred. We can say that we draw an inference, and that can refer to a proposition, in fact, right? So here we use inference both ways. There are people who have suggested other ways of other expressions for inferences. You will sometimes see syllogism, but that's not quite right because there are inferences that aren't syllogisms. And you will sometimes see argument. An argument is quite a bit more general. So neither of those is quite right. There's no great solution to this, and there's no universal solution to this. So this is one of the places in the course where I'll tell you that this is the vocabulary we're going to use. It's not exactly standard. You shouldn't necessarily expect that will be taught the same way everywhere, but absolutely everybody should know what you mean by an inference, no matter how they teach logic. So our terms express concepts, our propositions express judgments, and our inferences express inferences. All right, enough of that. Now we can go on to the domains of clarity, truth, validity, and soundness. Each act of the mind has its own standard for success or failure. Terms, for example, should be clear. It's bad, logically speaking, if they're unclear. Propositions should be true. It's bad, logically speaking, when they are false. Inferences should be valid. It's bad, logically speaking, when they are invalid. Now, is this just being picky about making up a new terminology? No, think about it. Can a term be true? What's a term? Chair is a term. If I just say chair, have I said anything true? Have I said anything false? No, because I haven't affirmed or denied anything. As long as we are stuck in the first act of the mind, there's nothing which can be true or false. All it can be is clear or unclear. Can a proposition be unclear? Well, yeah, but only insofar as the terms of the proposition are unclear. Insofar as it is a proposition, that is an affirmation or a denial, it will be either true or false. And what about inferences, and what about validity? Well, as we saw on the first day, I think, and several times since then, there can be arguments in which all of the propositions are true, but they still aren't valid arguments. For example, all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal, therefore Socrates is a man. We've seen already that that is an invalid argument. All three propositions there are true, But the third one, the conclusion, does not follow from the first two. So the inference from the first two to the last one is not valid. Soundness is a matter of all three of these things happening at one time. So for our reasoning to be sound overall, all of the terms must be clear, all of the propositions must be true, and all of the inferences must be valid. All three things must be there for soundness. Clarity plus truth plus validity equals soundness. By contrast, we consider an argument to be unsound if any one of those things goes wrong. That is, if any term is unclear, or if any proposition is false, or if any inference is invalid. This leads us once again to the only three things that can ever be wrong with a deductive argument. It can use terms that are unclear, it can use propositions that are false, or it can rely on inferences that are invalid. Those are the only three things. If you find an argument in which all the terms are clear, all the propositions are true, and all the inferences are valid, that argument is sound, and you must accept the conclusion of that argument. If you don't like the conclusion, you can go back and look and see, is there an unclear term? Is there an untrue proposition? Is there an invalid inference? But if you can't find one of those, then that argument is sound, and you must change your mind. You must adopt the conclusion, whether you happen to like that or not. One of the most important things that we'll learn this year. So that's our first pass at logic and language. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.